We are extremely happy to welcome Elizabeth Anderson from the University of Michigan. We, this time, isn't just the philosophy department, but also the Center for Ethics and Society and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Apparently the first time we three do something together. So that's also a cause for celebration. But the main cause for celebration is that Elizabeth Anderson is here, and she's going to give us a talk on the social epistemology of morality, learning from the forgotten history of the abolition of slavery. The format is a talk and then Q&A as usual, and then afterwards we're going to go have a reception at the faculty club. Okay. Welcome.
So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to address this group, and I'm especially pleased as I've been informed as the first time philosophers have engaged at Stanford on this topic and with the center. So today I'm going to be talking about the social epistemology of morality. And what I mean by that is, how do we learn? How do we come to moral knowledge? And what are the social relations in which we can acquire moral knowledge? My talk is structured around a critique of standard philosophical methodology. And I'll explain that a little bit. Philosophers are really familiar with this. Standardly, what we do, this is one dominant mode of moral reflection in philosophy. We think about, we do thought experiments. Like, do I think it would be okay if there's a runaway trolley to divert the track to kill one person instead of 5? And most people say, yeah, it's okay, you're saving more lives. And then you think, oh, I'm going to tweak that thought experiment a little bit. I'm going to ask, so do I think it would be morally okay if the only way to stop the trolley was to physically shove somebody on the track, one person dead, but you save 5? And most people say no, and then you try to work out how to make those intuitions consistent. So we focus on thought experiments, often in scenarios that are quite remote from experience. Moral inquiry is dialogic in form. Even if it's taking place in the head of one person, we think of objections and replies and responses and so forth, back and forth. Standard philosophical methodology is undertaken by one or a few philosophers, and it aims at achieving a kind of reflective equilibrium of intuitions and principles. We want to come up with a set of principles that accords with all of our intuitions about particular cases, and all of our intuitions about particular cases are explained by the set of principles. Now, as it happens within philosophy, several challenges have been posed to this standard methodology of moral inquiry. One is, why should we place confidence in intuitions and thought experiments that are extremely remote from actual human experience? My favorite example of this is Judy Thompson, in her famous paper on abortion, imagines a scenario in which people, instead of being reproduced by ordinary means, are propagated through people seeds that float in the air and embed themselves in your carpet. And then the question is, should you be forced to raise these children if you've carefully screened off the window screens to prevent any of these people seeds from coming in? And she wants to invoke the intuition, well, no, in fact, if you've taken all precautions, you shouldn't be forced to raise these beings embedded in your carpet. You should be free to vacuum them up. And I guess, my intuition about this is that if human beings really reproduce this way, everything else about society would be so radically different. I just don't really know what to say about what rules of morality should apply to beings like that. Here's a second challenge, which comes closer to the subject matter of this talk. Why think our intuitions, the current intuitions we have about what's right and wrong, why do we think that they're reliable now when we know that in the past they're deeply prejudiced? So here I'll give you an example of a famous moral philosopher of the 19th century who articulated the following moral intuition. This is a quote. Probably no one will hesitate to agree that the lower well-being of countless Chinamen or Negroes must be sacrificed, that a higher life may be possible for a much smaller number of white men. That was a moral intuition that he took to be practically self-evident. It was articulated by Hastings Rostill in The Theory of Good and Evil, which was published by Oxford University Press in 1924. Maybe we shouldn't trust these intuitions. Okay. 1924, yeah. And Rashta was a very distinguished philosopher of his day. Third challenge, associated with the first one, why do we think our intuitions are reliable now when we know that they've changed over time? So here's a really important case, and really the central case I'm going to be talking about today. About 300 years ago, you would find very few people in Europe or descended from Europeans but living in the American colonies who thought that slavery was morally wrong. And after about 250 years of struggle, it became an almost universal opinion that it's practically the paradigm of injustice. We see a really dramatic, profound change in foundational moral intuitions about right and wrong. So how can we trust any particular moment in time? And fourthly, reflecting back on philosophical methodology, this is a practice that's engaged in by philosophers, and philosophers tend to be we're weird. I mean, as samples of humanity, philosophers are not only sort of quirky and weird, but we're also demographically really narrowly selected. It's overwhelmingly male-dominated, very, very few African Americans and Latinos. Philosophy is far from a random sample of humanity. So why trust the intuitions of philosophers over the moral intuitions of all kinds of people who aren't philosophers? Philosophers also tend to be relatively privileged by profession. When they reflect, philosophers tend to be detached from the reality of the circumstances that they're reflecting about. Most professional philosophers are Western, and there's just really few of us. So I think that these challenges are really important, but I don't think that they undermine the possibility of making progress in moral inquiry. Rather, my reply is to expand our moral methodology along pragmatist and naturalized lines. First of all, I just want to narrow my focus a little bit. When I talk about reflection on morality, I'm talking about that very large and important subset of morality that deals with what we owe to each other, the obligations and duties that we have to each other. One could consider other dimensions of morality, like perhaps you might think about obligations to the self, and I'm just setting that aside. Some people have notions of sinful behavior, and I'm not interested in that either. Things like getting drunk or sexual promiscuity. I'm not interested in those notions of moral wrong. I'm only interested in moral wrong as an interpersonal thing where one person's doing something wrong to another person. And I'm going to take a broadly but loosely contractualist approach. So on a contractualist approach to right and wrong, the principles of moral rightness are the principles that we think ought to govern interpersonal claims that we make on each other. So they construct notions like rights and duties and accountability and responsibility and so forth. Contractualism loosely says that the right moral principles are the principles that free, equal, and rational people would choose to govern the interpersonal claim making, claims of right and responsibility that they make on each other. I'm also going to take a naturalized approach. So naturalized epistemology asks, how do ordinary people engage in inquiry, and what actual changes in practices of inquiry can help us make us do a better job in inquiry, okay? And from a naturalized point of view, we're interested not just in looking at the practices of moral inquiry of philosophers, but the practices of moral inquiry of all of humanity. We want then, from a naturalized point of view, to include a wider range of participants, Anybody who raises a moral claim or asks a moral question should be included in this project. But of course, not everybody is making philosophical arguments about their moral claims. And so we also need to expand the sorts of actions that count as moral inquiry. And I'm going to adopt a notion from the great sociologist Charles Tilly. He created this notion of contention. And contention describes a variety of modes of making interpersonal claims. At one end of the spectrum, you could make an interpersonal claim just by articulating a pure philosophical argument. For instance, that all human beings have natural rights to liberty. Okay, you could just make a pure philosophical argument like that as a way of making a moral claim. But we actually have a spectrum of possibilities, and there are many other ways to make moral claims. For instance, you can demonstrate in the streets, you can submit a petition to the state with thousands of signatures on it. You can file a lawsuit in court. You can engage in a bit of guerrilla theater to dramatize the injustice of some social practice. These are all modes of contention. You can stage a strike or a sit-in. These are ways of contesting, saying, I think this practice is wrong, it ought to be changed, and in this direction or that. Okay. I'm also going to take a pragmatist approach to moral inquiry. Pragmatists believe that that moral inquiry is not just a matter of pure a priori reflection, but that we can actually test moral claims in experience. Okay? And there's two basic ways that we can test these claims. One is we can ask whether, and here we're only going to be testing belief changes in our moral intuitions. Suppose we start off thinking that A is perfectly okay, and then we change our belief and start believing that A is morally wrong. Okay? We can ask of that change whether it constitutes an improvement, whether we've gained moral knowledge when we change that belief. Okay? How could we tell without begging the question in favor of what we concluded later? We can do so by asking whether the causal process that induced that change in moral beliefs is the product of a process that can be called an epistemic improvement. So for instance, we might have changed our belief in light of exposure to new evidence about the nature of the practice. Okay, so that's an epistemic improvement. Now we know more about what this practice is like, and that's why we changed. It could be that we have removed ourselves from circumstances in which we're liable to be very cognitively biased or emotionally biased and put ourselves into a situation where we're less liable to various cognitive and affective biases that have been identified by psychologists. Then we could count that belief change probably represents progress. A second way in which we could recognize progress in our moral intuitions is through experiments in living. It's a deep pragmatist theme that we test our moral intuitions and experience by putting them into practice and seeing whether we can live with the results. Okay? Does the adoption of a new moral principle solve the problems that the old moral principles couldn't solve? Or does it at least give us a new set of problems that we'd rather have to deal with than those old, horrible, intractable problems that our old social practices and principles couldn't really resolve? And can we live with the unintended consequences? Do we find life at least improved under the new moral principles compared to the old ones? So my picture then is going to be a naturalized contractualism. In ideal social contract theory, we undertake a thought experiment. We ask, what moral principles would free, equal, and rational beings, situated fairly with respect to one another, what principles would such persons choose to govern their lives, their interpersonal claims? And that's the kind of thought experiment that social contract theory uses. We assume that they're situated under fair conditions. A naturalized contractualism looks at the actual principles that contending parties have come to agreement over and see what results from actual processes of contention. Now, what could be, the great problem with actual social contracts, so to speak, is that they rarely, hardly ever take place under fair conditions. So we do know that the product of actual contention is liably biased in favor of the already powerful. However, there still are some epistemic advantages to looking at actual processes of contention over moral claims that resulted in change. And one is that often the contending parties have a much more vivid grasp of the stakes than philosophers in the seminar table who are speculating about what people would choose. Okay, the contending parties really have a much more vivid sense of what interests are at stake here, what the practices are that they're contending about, and so forth. The second epistemic advantage of looking at actual cases of contention is that in actual cases, people are using a much wider repertoire of modes of contention. Philosophers were just looking at pure philosophical argument, okay? Whereas people in the real world, right, are using a whole bunch of other ways to persuade people. Drama, novels, sit-ins, strikes, demonstrations. Maybe those other modes of contention actually are epistemically productive. That is, they jar people into moral recognition that they wouldn't have around the seminar table. In order to illustrate this, I want to take some case studies in moral thinking about emancipation. So what's interesting about this is that here we have a dramatic worldwide shift in people's moral intuitions, where once most people thought there was nothing particularly wrong, morally wrong with slavery, and now it's the nearly worldwide universal opinion that not only is it morally wrong to enslave people, but it's practically the paradigm of injustice. And what I'm going to look at, I'm going to select 3 episodes from the history of contention over the justice and injustice of slavery and see what we can learn from the actual history of contention about slavery. Obviously, I can't tell you the whole story about how moral opinion changed about the morality of slavery, so I can only take 3 episodes that I think are illustrative of the strategy. My first episode is to take a look at Nicolas de Condorcet and his arguments for abolition. And I want to contrast his abolitionism with his feminism. Condorcet was both an abolitionist and a feminist. We'll start off with his feminist argument. This is what he said. The rights of man result simply from the fact that they are rational, sentient beings, susceptible of acquiring ideas of morality and of reasoning concerning those ideas. Women, having then the same qualities, have necessarily the same rights. Very simple deductive argument, beautiful philosophical structure. He has no reservations, exhibits no hesitation, no backsliding at all. Women should immediately receive the right to vote, should immediately get the right to divorce their husbands. No hesitation at all about articulating equal rights for women on the basis of this very simple, pure, a priori moral argument. What about Condorcet's arguments for the abolition of slavery? This is what he said. Slavery violates the natural right of every individual to self-ownership. The slave owners have stolen the labor of the slaves, and as thieves are not entitled to 1 penny of compensation, because you don't compensate a thief when you seize the goods that he's stolen, right? They're not entitled to anything. And then he also added a pragmatic argument. He said, look, Europe loves its sugar, but free labor can produce sugar just as well as slave labor. So don't worry, you're going to miss out on your desserts. Okay, so a lot of the argument is parallel to his feminist argument, right? We have these natural rights. It's violated by slavery, so slaves are entitled to emancipation. But, Condorcet said, it shouldn't happen immediately. He argued for gradual emancipation. This is how gradual it was. He proposed for France's slave colonies in the West Indies that infants born into slavery should not be free until they reach the age of 35. Children under the age of 14 should not be free until they're 40. And slaves older than 14 would not be freed until they were 50 years old. What could account for this? Well, one might think that what could account for it was simply a necessary compromise with the slave owners. In France at the time, the colony of Saint-Domingue, currently known as Haiti, was responsible for producing 40% of Europe's sugar, 60% of its coffee. 1 out of 25 French citizens in France were employed in the colonial trade, somehow then dependent on slavery economically. 15% of the members of the Revolutionary National Assembly owned property in Haiti, that is, they were slave owners. Okay, so you might think he proposed gradualism because that was the only path to emancipation. You had to give the slave owners the opportunity to exploit the slaves, or they would never give them up altogether, but sort of get back the money that they had paid for them, essentially, by working them for so many years. But in fact, those were not Condorcet's reasons. He wasn't saying we have to compromise in this dirty way just in order to practically get them on a path to emancipation. These were his reasons. He said the reason why we had to be gradual is, firstly, that the masters would be so angry at emancipation that they would pose a danger to the social order. They're so used to the pleasures of absolute domination over the slaves that losing that and getting in return mere racial superiority wouldn't satisfy them, and they'd get on a mad rampage and start slaughtering people, their slaves. Secondly, he worried about the freed people. He worried that the slaves themselves, upon being emancipated, would get really angry and slaughter the masters out of revenge. He also worried that they would abandon the plantations and run off into the hills and live as savages and vagabonds. Thirdly, he argued that the slaves weren't ready to be free. They needed time to learn the responsible exercise of freedom since they'd never experienced it before. And hence we need gradual emancipation. We'll do it gradually. That way, the masters could receive some compensation for their loss of total mastery over the slaves. They could exploit them for a few decades before having to liberate them. Secondly, you'd have time to educate the slaves to exercise responsible freedom. They would learn how to be responsible through severe discipline. Well, who would teach them the responsible exercise of freedom? Well, he entrusted the masters with that task. Okay, it seems like Condorcet was really confused here. There were several contradictions in his argument. One is that women were also in subjection to their husbands under patriarchy, but he didn't consider the fact that they didn't have the experience of total freedom as a reason to delay their emancipation. Secondly, how could the masters possibly be competent to teach the slaves the responsible exercise of freedom when he had previously argued that the source of the slaves' moral corruption and inability to exercise freedom was due to the fact that the only model of freedom that they had before them was viewing what masters did with their freedom, which was to oppress the slaves. Not a very good role model. And how could masters be trusted to teach the slaves freedom when he feared that they were inclined to violent revenge once they lost their sadistic power over their slaves? Thirdly, if the condition of absolute subjection is morally corrupting and disables people from being able to be free, then how could you possibly justify holding infants born into slavery as slaves until the age of 35? After all, the moment you're born, you have no idea that you're a slave. You should emancipate them immediately so they never get the corrupting experience of subjection. They shouldn't be subject to enslavement at all, should be immediately liberated. So why did Condorcet go wrong? He seemed to be so clear-headed and consistent about his feminism, backsliding and racist even about his abolitionism. I think the conditions of moral reflection differed in these two cases. Condorcet was very detached from the slaves. To my knowledge, he never visited Haiti. He had no contact with slaves, very isolated. Whereas his feminism was inspired by his wife, Sophie de Grouchy, an important intellectual in her own right. She translated Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments into France. She ran an important salon in Paris. And he was constantly discussing things with her. That intimate association as an intellectual equal probably made him more responsive to her claims than the claims of distant slaves who he'd never met. Whereas with respect to these slaves thousands of miles away, it was easier for him to practice what I'll call authoritarian moral inquiry. And that's what happens when you kind of speculate about what's right and wrong with respect to a group without giving them a chance to intervene and put in their 2 cents. Okay, I'll call that authoritarian, not necessarily with respect to the content of the moral conclusions derived, but with respect to the style of moral reflection that's not inclusive of the people whose claims you're considering. Here's a second episode which deals with how the slaves themselves engaged in contention over slavery. Remember, contention, on my view, includes modes of claim making, of moral claim making, besides pure moral argument. Things like petitions, protests, strikes. And in the slaves' case, slaves had adopted their own repertoire of contention, their ways of disputing the claims of masters to rule every aspect of their lives. We know this from historians. Slaves, for instance, would often protest by deliberately breaking tools, or leaving the plantation without a pass, or learning how to read. All of these things were prohibited. Okay? In the United States, the resistance of slaves to the master's dominion, if it was systematic enough, would lead the slave states to pass laws prohibiting their particular modes of contention. So slave states passed laws prohibiting anybody from teaching a slave how to read, passed laws prohibiting slaves from owning books or having books in their possession or reading, prohibited slaves from leaving the plantation without a pass. And if they were caught doing these things, they would be subject to a criminal trial and held responsible for breaking the law. Now, what's important about this is that they were put into a common law court where the rules of criminal procedure endowed them with at least the rights of criminal procedure, the right, for instance, to testify in their own defense. And remarkably, these common law courts, even in the South, admitted into evidence certain defenses that are quite surprising. So we actually have real legal cases in the South where slaves who had been arrested for killing their masters were legally entitled to enter an argument of self-defense. Well, my master was beating me to a pulp, and I was going to die if I didn't strike back. And remarkably, because the right to self-defense is ensconced in the common law, we even had courts, although they wrestled over the issue because they saw how dangerous it would be for slaves to gain the right to use violence and self-defense against their master's violence, nevertheless acquitting slaves for killing their masters on the self-defense argument. What about Saint-Domingue? What was happening there? Well, one mode of contention that was available to the slaves in Saint-Domingue, but not so much in the United States, was escape. It was very widely practiced. It was known as marronage. They'd move to the hills and live on their own there. And the constant practice of escape led Paris to propose improvements to the Code Noir, the law, set of laws that's supposed to be regulating the relations between masters and slaves, because they saw that the breakdown of the slave system was possible if the slaves revolt against the tyranny of their servitude. And so they wanted to make slavery more tolerable to prevent the whole system from unraveling. And that included, for instance, expanding the right to leisure time and things like that. In both cases, both in the United States and in Saint-Domingue, another important mode of contention arose through the fact that both republics ended up depending on slaves to fight on their behalf in the US Civil War and in the Haitian Revolution. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So my model here is that certain modes of contention promote moral clarity by overcoming bias and blindness. Okay? So we could take a look, for instance, at what actually happened during the Haitian Revolution and during the Civil War. We saw slaves emancipating themselves in the Haitian Revolution by taking up arms, and in the United States Civil War by escaping behind Union lines and refusing to go back. What is the moral impact on people's consciousness of confronting emancipated people, people who are de facto emancipated from their masters? I want to tell a story like this, that living at the mercy of masters entails that masters don't have to resort to negotiation to get what they want. Okay, but once one has to deal with free people, some kind of negotiation has to take place. Even if it's radically unequal, the fact that negotiation has to take place, you can't just impose your will by force, requires some minimal recognition of the other's claims. And that inspires a kind of moral recognition of that person as having claims in the first place. Claims that need to be respected. There needs to be some kind of bargaining, persuasion going on, recognition of some standing, however minimal, of the other party in this bargaining or negotiation. Military service, I think, also, in fact, proved to be incredibly important for arousing moral recognition of the slaves' claims. How did it do so? On the one hand, it demonstrated that slaves really were fit for freedom. And this was acknowledged by all sides, including the Confederacy. So right towards the end of the war, the Confederacy was wondering, they're running out of manpower, maybe we should give uniforms to slaves and have them fight on our behalf. And several leaders of the Confederacy basically said, if slaves can make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. Because a good soldier is a paradigm of a citizen fit for freedom. But as a matter of fact, the slaves who escaped behind Union lines, many of them did acquire uniforms and fight on behalf of the Union. They proved their fitness for freedom. Similarly, in the Haitian Revolution, during that time of turmoil, both Spain and England were trying to pick off the colony of Saint-Domingue for themselves. The slaves, the self-emancipated slaves, rallied to the defense of the French Republic and, returned for this, essentially demanded freedom. It was very hard to resist those claims. After all, a certain level of gratitude that's invoked when people are fighting on your behalf. It's hard to deny that they're owed something as a response to that. Here's my third episode, which has to do with testing emancipation in practice. So remember, there's two modes of improving our moral beliefs. One has to do with moving from more biasing to less biasing circumstances in which we're less prejudiced. And the other is to actually put moral principles in practice and look at the results. Okay. How do we test emancipation in practice? Well, all the sides agreed that the case for slavery hung on the slaves' lack of fitness for freedom. If the slaves could actually show that upon emancipation, they could conduct themselves as free people in a responsible manner that would vindicate the anti-slavery cause. Emancipation then posed a test of fitness. Would the freed people exercise their freedom responsibly? However, this test depended on the background norm of responsible conduct for free people. How do we define what's the sort of operationalization of responsible conduct for free people? And it turns out that the slaves and the former masters disagreed about what would constitute responsible conduct as a free person. The slaves themselves aspired to personal independence. They basically wanted to be their own bosses. They wanted to be self-employed. They wanted to become peasant farmers or yeoman farmers, have their own plot of land, farm without supervision or having to take orders from any boss. They resisted the imposition of wage labor wherever they could. In the new Republic of Haiti, that was largely successful, and they achieved a peasant society. The plantation system completely collapsed. In the United States, it was much harder for the freed people to gain independent access to land. And so the process of struggle between them and the plantation owners who wanted to impose gang labor, supervised gang labor, resulted in a negotiated compromise around sharecropping in most of the South. Now, the leaders of post-emancipation societies had a very different concept of what responsible freedom would consist in, how the slaves would demonstrate that they were responsible. They thought what it meant was to exercise freedom responsibly meant accepting a system of wage labor and a continuation of plantation agriculture under the supervision of whites. Okay? So the question is, did the slaves fail the test? Well, from the whites' point of view, they did fail the test because both of them rejected the system of plantation labor. Okay? So, in fact, whites judged the situation in Haiti and in the slave South as a failure. That freed people had failed the test of freedom because they rejected wage labor on the traditional plantation system. And they saw in particular the Haitians as having reverted to barbarism, and even some white abolitionists were somewhat embarrassed by the collapse of the sugar trade, because peasants weren't really all that interested in growing sugar. First, they wanted to grow food for their own subsistence to feed their families. This is very important because, in fact, the sugar plantation system neglected the growth of subsistence crops, and slaves were literally starving to death. The slave population of Saint-Domingue was incapable of reproducing itself. Without the constant importation of new slaves, the population would have continually shrunk. So high priority for the self-emancipated freed people of the new Republic of Haiti was to grow enough food so that everyone could be adequately nourished. So here we have a contradiction in the standards of freedom. What the slaves considered to be responsible exercise of freedom and what the whites thought would constitute responsible exercise of freedom. However, there was a contradiction even within the minds of whites themselves. In fact, no free white people were willing to work on the plantations at the wages and work intensity that was demanded by the plantation owners. But nobody thought that white workers had failed the test of responsible freedom for refusing to accept these forms of labor. The ideal for free whites in the United States, under the Republican Party's ideology of free labor, was precisely to be self-employed on one's farm. Out west, you lay your claim. That's exactly what the slaves want. The slaves' aspiration and conception of responsible freedom was identical to what white Republicans wanted for themselves. And when whites achieved that, they were seen as the consummate exemplars of responsible free citizens. So how could it be that when blacks aspire to and achieve the same standard, somehow they're being irresponsible? So the fact that the Haitian freed people managed to achieve a nearly universal status of self-employed farmers should have been judged a success rather than a failure, even by whites' own standards, had they applied those standards consistently. What's the source of their moral blindness in this case? I want to go back to the moral psychology of unaccountable power. Okay? So, suppose you have one person who has total dominion over another person. And then you ask, how would that person's moral consciousness of right and wrong develop? How would that person think about their duties and responsibilities to the person over which they have absolute dominion? My suggestion is that a person in a position of absolute domination would tend to be systematically confused between what's good for themselves and what is the duty or obligation of the subjected person to do for them. Right? They would constantly confuse those things. Right? They would just think that whatever they wanted for themselves had to be the duty of the subject person to deliver to them. And that's because knowledge of right and wrong, of what we owe to other people and what other people owe to us, depends, it comes from the demands of other people. Okay? We don't acquire knowledge of right and wrong just by thinking in our own heads. We acquire knowledge of what's right and wrong. Think about a child growing up. A child growing up can often learn some things about good and bad just from her own experience. You know, you pull cookies out of the oven, and the little child thinks, wow, these are really good. Let me have it right away. They touch it, it burns. But they, okay, cookies aren't good until they've had time to cool off. That's something a child could learn on his own. But suppose a child's running out in a public park and sees some pretty flowers and starts picking them. How would the child ever acquire any knowledge it was wrong to do so? Only when some adult comes along and holds that child to account and says, that's wrong, you're not allowed to do that. This is public property, it's there for the enjoyment of everybody. Right? They had to be stopped and held to account. The difficulty with a person who exercises total dominion over another person is they're not going to be held to account for what they do to that person or what demands they make on that person. So they're going to be morally blind. Total power deprives people of the experience of being held to account with respect to the people they have power over. And consequently, it makes them morally incompetent to judge what they owe to those people or what those people owe to them. Now, suppose the power to impose one's arbitrary will over another person is lost. You no longer have the ability to order somebody around and make them do whatever you want. But suppose the people thereby liberated lack the power to hold dominant people to account. What would happen then? Then I think the formerly totally dominant people, the masters, will deem the people now emancipated as failures for not rendering the services they formerly did, for not continuing to serve their interests. Okay? And that's, I think, what happened when the freed people in the post-emancipation societies were condemned by the former master class. Right? They're no longer serving the master's interests as wage laborers, you know, in a wage system, and so they were deemed failures. What's at fault here is what I've called authoritarian moral inquiry. The one-sided imposition of moral standards on others without leaving them any room to give an account for themselves and make counterclaims and you know, to argue the case for themselves. So this is what I conclude from these 3 episodes. I'm using them as illustrations of how to undertake a naturalized pragmatist moral epistemology. What I've argued is that certain modes of contention over moral claims of what we owe to each other under certain conditions, lead to moral clarity and improvement of our moral beliefs. That certain kinds of contention, beyond just pure a priori moral argument, can force people to recognize moral claims of others in a way that pure moral argument doesn't necessarily do. Contention can force people to confront contradictions in their thought and have to resolve and clarify, make their views more consistent. Contention can force people to confront counter-evidence that they hadn't seriously considered about the nature of the practices involved. And consequently, the wider repertoire of contention that essentially all human beings can engage in can promote moral learning and clarity. The second thing I want to point out is that we're capable of testing moral principles in practice and not just in our heads and thought experiments. We want to test these principles in real life. But in order to do so effectively, we can't just make up a standard of success a priori without including the others. We need to include all the affected parties with regard to any moral principle in order to determine what's going to count as a standard of success. And thirdly, I want to suggest that we've now arrived at some rough criteria for determining when we're entitled to think that a moral intuition is more reliable than some other moral intuitions that people may have had at different times or under different circumstances. Moral intuitions are more reliable when, firstly, they are forged under inclusive conditions with free and open contention on the part of the less powerful. That is, moral intuitions forged under more egalitarian conditions, more inclusive conditions, allowing freer modes of contention over the content of those claims, is going to be more reliable. Secondly, moral intuitions are more reliable when they are tested in practice and not just in thought experiments. And thirdly, when they involve the affected parties and not just detached philosophers speculating about things around a seminar table or in a journal article. Thank you.
So we started with Plausible, right? So now we think that slavery is wrong or impermissible, and 250 years or 3 years ago, people thought it was right or at least permissible. And the question is, how do we know this is an instance of moral learning rather than some kind of change for the worse, or loss of moral knowledge or something? And then part of the answer seemed to be that you can look at the causal history or the process by which these beliefs were acquired. Then the thought is that our current beliefs, well, at least part of the story was, I think, that our current beliefs are based on, for example, a wider range of information, including particulars of the experience of the people suffering from slavery. So how can we know without begging the question that all that evidence is not misleading evidence?
Yeah, so take a look, for instance, at the arguments that were made by the abolitionists, both in the United States and in England. It's quite important that the abolitionists weren't just making pure natural rights arguments or purely biblical arguments. Some of them, those arguments were present, but they also thought it to be incredibly important to gather empirical evidence about what the practice of slavery was actually like, with the whippings and the beatings and the rape and so forth. And that actually played really important roles both in arousing people's sympathy, because normally you would think raping people's wrong. Murdering people, whipping people, these are sort of prima facie moral wrongs. When the slave owners tried to defend their system in the United States, they said, oh, we're just one big happy family here. Slaves are just subordinate members of a patriarchal family. So what's the problem? You Northerners, you're kind of intruding into our family system. And the abolitionists said, does a good father of a family rape his daughter? Which, of course, there were slaves who were raping their slaves and then went on to rape their actual biological daughters. So you could, right, even by their own standards, right, a good father is not going to be in the business of raping his own daughter. But that's what the masters are doing. So how could you say this is a good family? They're kind of condemned by even their own standards once you expose the evidence that they couldn't deny was relevant to the assessment of whether they were being benevolent patriarchs.
We know it's moral order because there's just a problem of consistency in the other views.
Well, it's not just that. I do think that, since I'm taking a pragmatist point of view, we don't have any perspective independently, completely independent of all moral assumptions from which to assess whether we have a genuine case of moral knowledge or not. So we're always bootstrapping on the basis of current moral beliefs. But contradiction isn't the only thing that we use. Appeal to moral sentiments is important too. Appeal to, a basal recognition that other people have claims. And that was something that came out when slaves were put on trial for killing their masters and breaking other rules. We just didn't even have a conception of how to hold people morally responsible for their crimes outside of this whole complicated structure of practices that was supposed to that manifested a recognition of slaves as morally responsible beings. But how could you deny that a person who you recognize as a morally responsible being who could be held accountable for crimes has no rights whatsoever? Doesn't the status of being a morally responsible being entail some rights? Well, in the common law court system, at least entail the right to answer for yourself, to be a witness in your own defense. And that logic was very hard to resist.
I just want to follow up on that very quickly. It sounds like what changed was not so much the moral intuitions, but simply the access to information or evidence, because the moral intuitions, by their own lights, as you said, the people who took slavery to be permissible found it contemptible once they knew what it actually looked like. So it seems to me, I'm having a hard time seeing how that is a shift in moral intuition versus what category this behavior fits in.
Yeah. So part of the issue here is we're looking at. People are struggling with a question of what moral principles are apt to apply to this particular class of human beings, okay? And to a certain extent, making vivid to people that these are real human beings who suffer just like everybody else, who have beliefs and aspirations to freedom, who are articulating arguments and making claims. Recognizing them as having that kind of humanity is really important. And that's sort of a quasi-empirical, but it's recognition, but it's mixed in with a kind of moral recognition as well. Since we're talking about people who are manifesting morally relevant qualities of personhood.
There's two kinds of mistakes people make. One can be a mistake about value, and one can be a mistake about facts. And so, with certain sorts of racism, what's happening historically a lot of times is mistakes about facts, where it should be seen like facts of capacities, where people do have a capacity or something like that. And so, in your story, you need to show more about how we're not just learning more facts and getting our facts straight, but also improving the values. And as you told the story, those two parts weren't clearly distinguished.
I don't think, well, as a pragmatist, I don't think there's such a sharp distinction, actually. And that it's kind of an artificial philosophical distinction. What's happening? Well, partly, it's nice that the slave owners didn't, at some level, understand that the system they were engaged in was a system of mass brutality rape, murder, whipping, bleeding, starving, mutilation. They at some level, they understood that it was unbelievably cruel and monstrous. But this is, it's ideology, right? So there's 1.5 million rationalizations for this, and a kind of refusal to confront the reality of the system they're living in. And that's one of the things that contention does. It's not so much that people were totally ignorant of the facts, but they were rather disinclined to kind of put 2 and 2 together, rather disinclined to reflect in a sustained manner at how brutal and horrible the system was. And that's why the abolitionists had to be in your face, right? They had to make the horrors more vivid to really move people. It's one thing to sort of know in the abstract something, quite another to be vividly confronted with it. That's a cognitively, morally very important thing. You know, in the abstract, we know that the United States government is sending drones out and killing people thousands of miles away, among whom are civilians, which seems really distant and hard to really get people to be moved about this. But you put some videos on YouTube, right, that spread virally. People see little children getting torn limb from limb. Hence to focus the moral mind a little bit more about whether certain practices are really objectionable.
So I wanted to say, first of all, I think that your general argument about that moral deliberation is improved when you have contestation, I think is one that I accept, and I have no problem with that. However, I can't help but wonder where racism is in your argument as a whole, because you haven't brought it in. And it seems to me that there's a lot that is just not explained if we don't take into account the active project of dehumanization that took place alongside the project of turning people of African descent into dehumanized entities who could then be savaged and brutalized. And I mean, and partly I see this because in hearing from historians, say Professor Jim Campbell, who's done a lot of work on the history of slavery in the United States, he makes the point that slavery as a phenomenon has a long history, and that what is unique about American slavery is merely that it became associated with one particular kind of human being. So what many people have argued, and I think that's an implicit argument in what Professor Campbell said, is that what's odd is not that what we started to see more generally was a condemnation of slavery. But then what had to happen was the development of a kind of color-coded idea of certain kind of people in order for them to be enslaved. So that the intuition, the moral intuition, came from somewhere, but not necessarily from the contestation. I mean, what did come from the contestation of the slaves in Haiti, what did come from the contestation of is liberty. I mean, basically they just couldn't hold them that long. But I think that I think that there needs to be some account of racism and the active project of dehumanization that was put in place by the white slavers in order for us to really understand the phenomenon that we're discussing.
Yeah, so I didn't use the term racism, but I think it's implicit in my argument, and I think it'd be woven in completely consistently, just to point out that one source of moral blindness is an ideology of systematic dehumanization of people of African descent. Absolutely. I mean, so part of the argument also has to bring in ideology critique, and how do you jar people into recognition these are real human beings here. And that, again, I think the vivid confrontation with the realities of slavery was really important. Not just knowing in the abstract that these things are happening, But really having vivid testimony from escaped slaves themselves, slaves' narratives are playing an incredibly important role. People like Frederick Douglass testifying in church, right, about the horrors of slavery as a real human being, and not just some, we know these people are there, right? He's speaking to northern audiences who probably never visited the South for the most part. Right, that project of making vivid the humanity of the people who were subject to slavery and supposedly, right, subhuman is very important.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right, but I think first we have to make vivid the way that people were rendered non-human.
Yeah.
Because I think, so I don't know if you've had a chance to read Toni Morrison's wonderful, 2008 novel, A Mercy. Because what she's doing is going back and looking at the historical record to look at how, the question that she formulates that novel around is, what was it like to be a young girl slave when there was no shame attached to being a slave, because most people were. And that was what's interesting is if you look at the economy of early America, for instance, most people were in some kind of unpaid servitude, white and black. And then it was only over time that blackness became associated with servitude. So I think it's the two things we have to look at.
Yeah. It's a little bit complicated because forced labor was incredibly widespread, even apart from the practice of chattel slavery, but turning people into property up for auction who didn't have any right to a family, right? The family could be broken up and sold to different masters. That's it's not just the fact that people are forced to labor, but the fact that they are deprived of all kinds of other rights, to having their family. That I think is really distinctive of the practice of chattel slavery and goes way beyond just forced labor, which was seen all over the place in many different forms, debt peonage and so forth.
When slavery became associated with blackness.
Yeah, although actually, but slaves actually, people were enslaved before the ideology of racism arose to justify it. So originally it was like, well, it's okay to enslave heathens, but not Christians. There's all kinds of opportunistic arguments. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, the Native Americans were the first American slaves. There were like 10,000, maybe 100,000 before the blacks. It doesn't affect the point about racism, but just, yeah. Right. Okay, we have so Ken and Deborah and then Black. Sure.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm trying to distill them into a simple question. So excuse me if I'm, but okay, I have practiced as meetings, and I say there's something called the dialectic of gratification and resistance, and that's how moral life gets going. It strikes a balance in that dialectic of gratification and resistance. So I'm on board with it. But the thing that one might think is that if you believed in moral truth and moral knowledge, you might think there is something toward which we work, and the closer we get toward that. And a process counts as producing moral truth, moral knowledge, if it gets us closer to the external standard. I take it as a pragmatist, at least.
Yeah, that's not
a
yeah.
Not so.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what in your theory entitles you to talk about moral progress, moral truth, rather than mere change. You might think like Phil Kitchener, who thinks, well, it's a matter of there's an initial moral problem, and there's this technology of social life that gives us better solutions to this original moral problem, and because the moral project is in the business of solving this ongoing moral problem, but it's like technological progress, right? And he's got all these constraints on what counts as progressive, right? It can't just mere change, it's going to be any kind of plausible future from here would include this and all that sort of stuff, right? I didn't hear anything like that. You just said in response, well, there are more people, there's consistency, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think that's really enough to answer the kind of challenge implicit in the question. I mean, if you said the Kitcher kind of stuff, that might be enough, but I doubt that Kitcher actually has enough to answer that.
Yeah, so Kitcher is kind of, I think he's thinking about is he talking about progress in science rather than in morals?
I'm talking about progress and morality. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just,
So, I mean, I'm on board with that to the extent that we see moral principles as that is concrete moral principles instantiated in actual practice as attempting to solve certain kinds of problems. Okay? And I'm on board with that because that's a standard pragmatist picture. So you could think, one moral problem that every society has to face is production of the means of subsistence. Okay, every society needs to solve that problem. Okay, what system of production and system of productive social relations can we institute to make sure that people are fed and humanity can reproduce itself? Well, for the longest time, the argument for forced labor of all kinds, not just chattel slavery, but indentured servitude, debt peonage, all kinds of forced labor, was that people aren't going to be willing to work unless they're forced, right? That could be tested in experience, right? If humanity would starve to death, if labor weren't forced, well, maybe we'd have to force some labor. But turns out that it's possible to create not just a self-reproducing society, but a vastly more prosperous and happy society with free labor. That's a pragmatist argument.
yeah, I still don't.
Yeah.
Okay, so the worry is addressed to a pragmatist.
Yes.
Who doesn't think there's an external something toward which.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But a kind of change. The worry that you address to a pragmatist is why is that progress rather than mere change? Right? And Kitcher has an answer, a proposed answer to why it counts as progress and not just mere change. I don't actually hear an answer to that challenge in anything that you've said. That's what I don't see.
So, look, we had a former kind of understanding of what it took to produce the means of subsistence. So at some level there's an acknowledgement here that people are suffering under forced labor, doing stuff that they don't want to do. Now you show that you can achieve something better than that. Prosperous society where people aren't being forced. It's win-win all around. Why isn't that a better system? Who would contest that that's a better system?
Well, you want to continue the people who lost in that thing, the people who no longer get the command.
Right, and so then the claim is, okay, so and what gives their complaints greater authority over the masses of people who've been emancipated?
That's the point. There is no quote, external authority by which there is just the contest of authority. There may be stable outcomes, there may be, these guys may win, but the person who worries about objective morality says to the pragmatist, yeah, you can tell this kind of story of how this spread and that, but why is that anything? If you don't have an external standard,
so, look.
But I just don't see how you answer that.
Well.
I mean, I think there is maybe an answer, but I don't see it in your way.
So what do you think is the answer?
I think I've got a book in progress about this. I'll talk about it over here. I'll talk to you about it over here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's something to be said for it is true that, we had a master class who was very intransigent and resented everything that happened to them, okay, when they were deprived of their slaves. But over time, and maybe it's just because they died out, but we don't see, if it really is a morally compelling system, how come you don't have new people, complaining?
I'm starting to think like Kitcher, because the progressive changes are ones that are stable under all rational pressure that can't be reversed. That's the kind of argument you'd have to give on a kind of this kind of is a point of convergence that is self-sustaining and these other things aren't. They walk around crazily and blah, blah, blah. But still, it's not even clear. He thinks you can get some kind of reconstructed notion of moral truth out of that. I think all we can get is, well, it's stable under pressure. Why count that as truth? Why count that as knowledge? Unless you're going to say knowledge just is a complement to, we pay to, you know, beliefs that we think are stable under further rational pressure, whether or not they matter. So, I mean, I just think it's hard to solve questions.
Well, yeah, I'm not interested in trying to model this as correspondence to a totally independent moral truth.
Of course not.
So, but I don't see why we need that. Yeah.
So I think my question follows on some of these questions and also relates to Paula's point about racism. So I'm very sympathetic to this model of, you know, learning through contestation, and that there are empirical facts that bear on our moral outlook. So our moral outlook isn't derived independent of facts, so that facts can change our moral outlook. But this is a question I've asked you before about this talk. You know, I'm not sure it's empirical all the way down. So take the idea that people are fundamentally moral equals. That's an idea that's opposed to racism. So some racism is based on empirical errors or empirical assumptions that you can contest and show are false. But some races are just intrinsic racists. They just deny the idea that people are moral equals. I don't see how the methodology you give could help us with this, you know, give us evidence in favor of the idea that we're all moral equals, or give us evidence that would deny that we're all moral equals. So that just seems like I'm with you until you think, like, does this system go all the way down, or does there have to be something that's not itself bootstrapped up out of our experiences?
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's something I've wrestled with, because, right, foundational moral equality in the sense that that simply in virtue of being a human being, you know, we're entitled to make moral claims or have moral claims made on behalf of us if we're not able to articulate those claims ourselves. I agree that there's something kind of mysterious about where that comes from and how to justify it, but I'm pretty confident that every attempt to justify the contrary is totally bogus. I mean, you know, just every attempt to say, try to defend racism as a moral proposition just fails radically to kind of just, you know, what is the actual difference here that we're talking about? How could that you know, are the differences empirically real? Usually not. Are the differences, you know, sort of like skin color? Like, how could that possibly be morally relevant? If it were morally relevant, does that mean that, you know, people with tans suddenly lose moral standing? You know, it's all kinds of sort of rhetorical strategies you can use to kind of move against claims, sort of foundational claims to moral inequality. But I agree with you. You know, I don't have either. I don't have a clear path to argue a foundational assumption of moral equality, other than just to refute all the arguments against it, and to point to the experience of living as equals as something that once you're in it, and learn how to live that way, that experience is a positive experience.
Let me insert my question here as a follow-up, because it'll come up almost, and then go to you, and then we should get to the trade there. So if I understand the concern here, it's not so much defend this fundamental moral assumption, but like what do you take it to be doing, right? What do you take it to be arguing? And I was wondering throughout the talk whether these examples that you give that are compelling, very compelling read in a certain way, and I'm just not sure what the other reading is. So there's certain ways, like, well, here are cases where some agents making an important decision, get access to more evidence. What does the evidence pertain to? The supervenience base of the moral truth. Like, here's more evidence there. Here's, oh, it's actually they're suffering like us. Okay, that's wrong. That's wrong is not something that they get more evidence for, right? I mean, only they get it in virtue of getting evidence for the certain, that certain features are insanity that on which wrongness supervenes. I mean, that's so that's one reading that isn't, I think, all you have in mind, because you really. So I'm just wondering, what that extra, how do you see that extra?
Right, and that's where I'm appealing to things like vividness, because it's possible to kind of have purely sort of cognitive uptake of certain facts. And that's sort of the model that we have in philosophy. You've got your a priori moral principles, and then you uptake certain facts, and that compels certain conclusions through the deductive argument. It's just like Condorcet's argument for feminism, okay? But I think in reality, things aren't that simple, right? In reality, you have to make the facts really vivid and salient and moving. You have to clothe the facts in normatively powerful language. It's possible to describe a whipping in such clinical and detached terms. It's all factual. But in such clinically detached terms that it's hard for people to really grasp its moral significance. But to have the testimony of a person who's actually been whipped, to show the scars, the suffering, right?
Well, I'm just wondering, there's another effective distinction in the concrete and the abstract, right? Or some version of that. Like, I mean, I show you a painting of a kid that's been killed by a drone strike. That's going to be very effective, just like a photograph can. Whereas, I'm just describing, you have 4 casualties. And this ties in with this idea that, the methodology you're describing is some alternative to the thought experimentation. I would have thought that it's not. They're just having different, it's a different.
Well, I mean, I think what that shows is that, say, we can't assume that, some channels of information uptake can be more morally powerful than others. Yeah, like photos, personal testimony. Whereas abstract descriptions of something happening distantly, you sort of know is happening, doesn't quite arouse our moral imaginations as effectively. Yeah.
So, you like
during the break of the last talk, I was talking a little bit about Hegel, and I was currently reading the phenomenology of the famous Lordship and Bondage chapter. What Hegel was abstracting from, what was his ideas coming from about slaves and masters. And of course, I always ask my professors that as a good student, and they said it came from Aristotle. The notion of slavery, there's long and long tradition in philosophy. But more recently, we know that Hegel was reading about the Haitian Revolution. So, experience. He was reading daily newspapers. He was following the Haitian Revolution, and so it grounds in him. We disagree what that means, but I'm just thinking now we have some. It's not just a metaphor.
Yeah. Right. So I think the thought that Hegel, when he's talking about lordship and bondage, is thinking about Aristotle, I think that's like a crazy reading. Because Aristotle thought they were natural slaves. It's like, whereas, Hegel's whole story, the history of human history is the history of the progress of freedom. So, now it is true that Hegel himself is a racist, and so, he thought of Africa as the place where no history was happening. So he had a lot of problems with really,
of course, we know that if Hegel had had an opportunity to read Frederick Douglass, his story about the dialectic would have been very different. I mean, one of the powerful, vivid scenes in the narrative by himself is that Douglass confronts his slave master,
Right, and that is a great Hegelian episode, and another great Hegelian episode, actually. So the stuff I was telling you about these trials of slaves in the South actually embodies a kind of Hegelian dialectic that was uncovered by the historian James Oakes. So I was really taking his account of these court cases where you could see, right, they're kind of, the whole criminal court system in the South is caught into contradictions, because on the one hand, slaves are supposed to be rightless beings, they have no claims whatsoever, but then, well, how are you going to hold them criminally responsible? You got to have a trial, you have to prove that something bad happened, you need evidence, right, testimony, their rights of criminal procedure. They didn't even know how to proceed without according at least procedural rights to the slave. But then the slaves got the right to tell their own story about what happened. And what, you're going to treat that as gibberish? It's not really language, but it's testimony. You have to kind of like, and assess it as testifying to events that took place. And so the courts, Oakes, in his wonderful book, Slavery and Freedom, looks in detail at the judges wrestling with this practical contradiction between, on the one hand, assuming that slaves have no rights at all, subhuman, whatever, that the whole system of slavery depends on this, and on the other hand, the practical needs of institutionalizing a system of holding slaves criminally responsible for their acts and recognizing that criminal responsibility is a form of moral responsibility. That entails recognizing them, as having a kind of humanity. And so that's a true Hegelian dialectic here, right? They're wrestling with a contradiction, and they found themselves forced to acknowledge that slaves had a right to self-defense against their master's violence. Pretty remarkable.
So these trials were going on even before the end of this.
I'm sorry.
Is it a quick follow-up?
Very quick.
Yeah.
Even before the end of the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, they were really starting, these trials implied a certain due process.
This was before the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
It's very isolated.
Yeah.
I really like the story, but I wonder, what do you mean by learning? So, as I understood your presentation, you have a very vague notion of learning. So, you're making a very strong claim, saying that people learn through contestation. But you didn't give us any example of concrete learning. So, one could argue that, for example, the slave owners had to learn from the contestation. But I would doubt that, clearly. So, so what you show us is a change through history, but I wouldn't denote that as learning, because I think learning is something personal. I learned that you are like this or that, and you are different, and you're not as I'm expected to be, and all that. So, maybe, I think you have a very good theory, but maybe slavery isn't the best example for your theory of learning. I don't know, but it's hard to bring together those two things.
Yeah, so my story is not really a story of individual learning so much as social learning or whole society's learning. Morality is a system of social practices and not just a set of propositions that individuals had. So I'm thinking about how societies kind of engage in learning.
Very pragmatist in a way to think of society if you talk about learning. So I would say that, that's how you explain all the thinking to us. You said people learn, but then when you talk about society, you don't talk about people, you talk about big entities.
Well, society is, individuals in relationship to one another, reproducing over time. But they are founded on systems of cooperation, claim-making, duties, obligations. that people have to one another. And the contestation is over the content of those principles that regulate their interactions. So it's not solipsistic.
Yeah, but when you talk about contestation, you talk about practices. But when you talk about learning, you talk about society, and there's a rupture between that. So it's hard to...
I don't quite see the rupture. I'm talking about social practices. So these are practices that we do together with each other.
You could argue that, for example, the slave owners, they were fought, and on the long run, they just died out. And that's a good solution for it, maybe, I don't know. But, and I think that's a moral change. I would give you that point. That's a good point. But I think it's not through learning. It's, then you need a theory of learning and all that, and I can't see that in your presentation.
Yeah, I guess I don't see why. It takes a lot of kind of work in social ontology to defend this, but a good number of philosophers have done the work. So I'm piggybacking on the idea that social groups are capable of sustaining cognitive states like beliefs and intentions and plans and attitudes. So I'm piggybacking on that work in social ontology, that these are not just properties of individual minds, but that organized groups, societies, can also manifest beliefs and intentions and so forth. But that's, gets us into different territory.
I thank you for your interesting moral epistemology. So I want to ask a question about the level of moral epistemology. By grading two difficult cases, which your theory might not apply, so by grading two difficult cases, I want to ask you to say more about your moral epistemology. It seems to me that your explanation can apply to the slavery argument, but it may not apply to other cases. So I want to ask grade two case. The first case, the reason is it can be easily explained in the slavery systems. It's already disagreement has gone. So now we agree. So when your theory can explain about the agreed facts now, they can explain very well. But we expect the moral theory to provide more, not simply explain what happens, how we agreed this kind of moral agreement. We need more, some giving guidance, practical guidance when we have ongoing disagreement. So how we can apply your theory to the ongoing moral issue. For example, in our society, there are sharp disagreements, death penalty and death penalty. Or Republicans state their concept about tax is robbery. Someone's tax is really necessary for welfare systems. Do we have to do a terrorist suspect, the torture to the terrorist suspect or not? Then, in this case, how we can decide, or when I go selection to more agreed conclusion, whose view is more less biased or less prejudiced? Can we apply your theory to ongoing disagreement issue? Because I think the practical guidance is very important as a moral theory, as a one virtue of moral theory. So how to explain that the ongoing disagreement issue? In the second case, your theory can apply to the case of slavery systems because victims and those who have the benefit are in the same community. They are meeting every day. They are using the same language. So they are in the life of family. They can see every day. So they can expand their sympathy. So it works very well, some community, very small community. But these days, global some issue, it happens. So we are detached from the person who has a burden and then who gets the benefit. Very detached, not simply geographically. They cannot say they cannot say in English how they are suffering is very blocked. We can see it with our product, but we cannot see how our clothes is made. The before globalization, our clothes is made in our society, so we can see how our clothes is made, so we can walk from empty shirt to shop. But these days, they are very far, and then, so of course, Spivak said somebody cannot speak because we cannot hear their voice. So not simply power difference, but because also some misrepresentation or some long distance or some global issue we cannot hear. So in that kind of global issue, how we can apply this theory to that kind of issue?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So,
Can you repeat the question?
okay, all right. So the question is, how can my theory be applied not just to sort of settled cases like slavery, but ongoing disputes, especially when those disputes involve moral claims that very distant people have on us? So we consider, for instance, how the clothes that we're wearing right now are the product of grievously exploited people in distant countries. And so the speaker was citing Spivak and the question of whether we can even hear what the subaltern speaks. So I think that's exactly right. The model of moral learning that I'm proposing here can be instantiated within a society governed by democratic principles. You know, the upshot of my story is you're liable to have a more kind of morally successful, aware society that's run on democratic principles, where everyone's included, and we have this, you know, the whole repertoire of modes of contention that receive constitutional protections, freedom of speech and assembly, demonstrations, strikes, and so forth. And so then the question is, though, we've only learned how to embody democracy within not really small communities. I mean, you know, we have large-scale democracies, but there are real issues of scale here, and pretty good arguments that political theorists and political scientists come up with that you probably can't scale up democracy to the whole globe. So we're going to have to use other techniques to get the message across and make it vivid. Now, luckily, you know, in a high-tech society, we are expanding our capacities to communicate across language barriers, to bring the realities of distant events and make them vivid through YouTube and, you know, the internet and this kind of stuff. Our communicative abilities are dramatically expanding with technology. So, you know, that's a place where I would like to place some hope. But I agree with you. The division between states is a very formidable barrier to making progress on issues of global justice. It's just really, really too easy for citizens of a given state to neglect the consequences of their behavior on very distant people who are less powerful than them.
You said in answers to some of the other questions that you're more concerned ultimately with the success of communities at getting things right, and despite the fact that your examples were drawn from the West, I suppose in the long term a story of success. I mean, a lot of the more interesting details are about two cases of cognitive failure. Conversations on the slavery side and the slaves had failed to test the freedom as laid it out. Now, we can, as you tell these stories, they look like, they look like cognitive failures that are easy to spot in retrospect, but such that even sincerely reflective people of fundamental goodwill are earnestly concerned to get these sorts of things right and actually enjoy certain epistemic advantages. Would understandably get them wrong at the time. Now, I guess I'm wondering. Well, roughly. Could Condor say recently been expected to do any better given his recent sources and opportunities, and if not, just reflecting on his situation, at least put us as individuals in a position to do any better in a like situation.
Yeah, so Condorcet definitely was reasoning under adverse circumstances and to a certain degree. And I think that's characteristic of powerful people who are insulated from direct face-to-face challenges to the system they live in. So, perhaps we couldn't have expected more. Now, I think it's quite interesting that if you look at 18th century abolitionist literature, almost all of it looks like Condorcet. It's all about gradual emancipation. We got to take our time. It's going to be maybe 100 years, and people abolitionists didn't start getting really impatient until like maybe the 1830s or so. And then they're just saying now, immediate. And what was behind that? I think part of it was, particularly in the case of France and in England, actually, there was some thought that, it would take some recognition that it would involve a lot of violent conflict to immediately emancipate the slaves. I mean, it would be like war. That causes a lot of bloodshed in its own right. And in the West Indies, what's important about slavery was that it was not a self-reproducing system. Slaves were being worked to death, okay? Infant mortality was incredibly high. They could not reproduce the population, hence the slave system depended on the slave trade. And so certainly it was an explicit understanding of the opposition to the slave trade in England. The assumption was, hey, all we have to do is cut off the supply and then the institution will die out of its own accord and we won't have to fight like some bloody war, like have some really violent conflict. So I think that was probably going on. And then, with the invention of the cotton gin and people realized in the United States at least, this institution could last forever if you don't start, just that I think was a powerful motivator. It sharpened the mind in a way. Yeah.
Sort of still piggybacking on the idea of how to say that change had happened was better. I sort of wanted for you to develop more ideas about how, is there something intrinsic about saying that the problems that were encountered with society after slavery was abolished was better than the problems that people were asking when it was still around? There's a sense in my impression about being a pragmatist that we associate with something else. What's the most intrinsic thing, the way that pragmatists would say that the questions now offered from this change are better tackled? We'd rather tackle these questions rather than these.
So, even shortly after the war, although many former masters just wanted to return to chattel slavery, quite a lot of them were reconciled to the idea that, okay, you got to pay a wage. So that didn't stop them from being white supremacists. It didn't stop them from wanting to impose some other form of involuntary servitude. But even acknowledging the right of freed people to have families that you couldn't just like split up and sell off to other people, that's unquestionably a dramatic advance for the freed people themselves, notwithstanding what other oppressions they were subject to. Unquestionably an advance from the perspective of Northerners. And even the former slave owners. You don't really see them after the war saying that it was, really important to have the power to split up the families of the former slaves and sell them off to distant parts. They found other ways to, get on with cotton production, discover themselves that they didn't need to resort to that kind of extremity. So I'd say that even for the more intransigent master class, I think they came to recognize that certain kinds of oppressions were not vitally important.
It's basically you're giving this feeling that you have less of a problem now than you had before.
Yeah. So right. I mean, every society, right? When we change our moral principles, like we never get utopia. There's always going to be continuing conflict, continuing problems, right? Problems never end. It's just sort of the human condition. But you can't say, well, rather work with these problems than former ones.
We have two more questions on the list, and if they're brief, we didn't have time for both.
Okay, good. I want to come back to the idea of intention as a way of gaining moral knowledge. And I guess I just wanted to hear a little more about how normative your notion of contention is, because I take it that what drives people toward the ideal forms of contractualism is that the actual examples of contention that we have in our society are just more broadly tend to be, unequal forms of contention or not fully free forms of contention. And it seemed like you wanted to say, so it would be better if they're more equal or more free. But then it seems to be leading us back into the philosophical classroom that way. I mean, I know that clearly has its problems as well. So I guess I just want to hear more of where exactly your as far as this goes.
So, this in a way ties into Deborah's question about, how to justify the assumption of moral equality. I would love to be able to tell a really good story. I don't really have one. But I do think that, looking at things more holistically, that life in relations of equality is experienced by the participants. It's a better way to be once they're in it. Of course, there's a lot of resistance before, right? If one is used to a position of domination, it can feel really threatening to move to greater equality. But historically, most of the fears associated with moving towards equality aren't realized. People do learn how to live on more equal terms. So I think the experience satisfaction of people once they're in it disproves the fears and opposition of people objecting to it, to moves in that direction.
Yeah, so I have a question which I think relates to the theory of relativism or the possibility of multiple stable petitions. So I wonder whether your pragmatic view kind of creates some indeterminacy when we deliberate what principle to accept. So I mean, in the case of slavery, it's really hard to make a society which is stable, within slaves in it. But I mean, I'm thinking about secession v. integration kind of juncture. So in a society, two groups relate to each other on unequal terms due to segregation. So let's say segregation is unstable. They have to accept either secession or integration. But I mean, it seems possible, or I cannot rule out the possibility that both options are, if they accept one option, down the road they will end up learning to live with the option. Meaning, if they take the integration option, they will create a democratic society where each person relate to each other on fair and equal terms in one society. But secession, two societies, in each society, they are fair and equal. I mean, if that's possible, then your pragmatic view doesn't seem to tell them what path to take. So I wonder whether that is implication that you're happy with, or I'm misunderstanding what your view's implication is.
Yeah. So moral learning is path dependent. Path dependent. And so we do observe different societies coming to different settlements. And sometimes secession works out better. Look at the Czech Republic and Slovakia splitting off. Those are very rare, by the way. Most of the time, countries put up a fight. But in this case, they didn't. So maybe that, seems to be working better for them. I don't know the details of that particular case, just sort of from reading a little bit in the newspaper. So yeah, I don't really have a, problem with path dependency. In a pragmatist view, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't entail relativism in the standard sense, right? In the standard sense of relativism, the idea is that every culture is right by its own standards. And that, I think, creates a very static picture, which is totally unrealistic. Every society is riven with conflict. So how can it be right by its own standards? That assumes that we already achieved sort of like total consensus over the way society operates, but no society works that way. So what are its own standards? Every society's standards are riddled with contradictions that haven't been resolved yet. A lot of work left to do, all kinds of unresolved problems. So no society is right by its own standards. And also, from a pragmatist point of view, just because a moral standard came from another country doesn't necessarily mean that it might not work for a given society. Try it on and fits. See if it fits. Maybe you could learn from other societies. Why not? Learning comes from all corners. So that's why I'm not a relativist, even though I'm happy to take on board path dependency.
So we'll now thank Elizabeth again, and then we'll go ahead with reception, during which I'm sure the discussion will continue with Professor Stefan.